History often paints royalty as noble, majestic, and untouchable, figures draped in gold, sitting upon thrones, ruling nations with wisdom and authority. But behind those gilded crowns and jeweled gowns, there existed secrets so dark that entire kingdoms tried to bury them. Secrets of marriages that broke not just moral boundaries, but even the natural laws of family and blood. Imagine this: a king taking his niece as his queen. A royal brother marrying his sister to keep the bloodline pure. Cousins forced into unions, their children born with twisted fates, all justified in the name of power. What today would be called shocking, disturbing, and forbidden, was once not only tolerated but celebrated in the halls of medieval courts. Why? Because for kings and queens, love was never a choice, it was a weapon. Marriages weren't about romance, they were about power, alliances, and control. And when the fate of an empire rested on who married whom, rulers were willing to break the ultimate taboo: incest. But here lies the horror: these forbidden marriages didn't just break moral codes, they reshaped entire dynasties. Some kingdoms rose, others crumbled. Bloodlines became twisted, heirs were born with curses whispered to be divine punishments, and history itself was forever changed. In this story, we'll journey into the shadowy chambers of royal courts, uncovering the forbidden unions kings and queens swore were for the good of the realm. From ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, from the Spanish Habsburgs to the pharaohs of old, these marriages carried with them betrayal, tragedy, and consequences that still haunt us today. This is not the history you were taught in school. This is the dark side of royalty, where family ties became chains, and where the cost of keeping blood pure was often death itself. Crown: what monarchs dared to defy morality for power? Cross swords: what kingdoms fell because of bloodlines poisoned by incest? Scroll: and what lasting scars did these unions leave on history? The answers lie ahead. But beware, once you step into this world, you'll see that behind every glittering crown was a secret dripping with sin, desperation, and betrayal. If there was ever a dynasty that turned incest into a royal tradition, it was ancient Egypt. For the pharaohs, the idea of marrying a sister, daughter, or close relative wasn't seen as scandalous, it was seen as divine. In fact, they believed that by keeping their marriages within the family, they were imitating the gods themselves. According to Egyptian mythology, the great god Osiris married his sister Isis, and their union produced Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. To the Egyptians, this was not taboo, it was holy. If the gods themselves practiced it, then surely mortal kings should do the same to prove they carried divine blood. Thus began a chilling cycle. Pharaoh after pharaoh sealed his throne by marrying within his own bloodline. Brothers married sisters, uncles took nieces as queens, and daughters were offered as wives to their fathers. The justification? Keeping the bloodline pure, uncontaminated by outsiders. But this pursuit of divine blood came with dark consequences. Take the famous Pharaoh Tutankhamun, often known as King Tut. He is one of the most studied mummies in the world, and modern science has revealed a horrifying truth about him. His body showed evidence of numerous deformities: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and fragile bones. Genetic testing confirmed what history long suspected: his parents were brother and sister. The pure bloodline had become a curse. Yet, for the pharaohs, the risk of physical deformities didn't matter. Their priority wasn't the health of their heirs, it was the power of their throne. Each incestuous marriage sent a clear message to rivals and outsiders: our bloodline is sacred, untouchable, godlike. It was both a symbol of unity and a weapon of intimidation. But over time, this obsession with purity weakened the very dynasties it was meant to protect. As generation after generation married within the same bloodline, genetic weaknesses grew. Heirs were fragile, sickly, and often died young, leading to power struggles, instability, and even collapse. The irony was brutal. In their attempt to imitate gods, the pharaohs doomed themselves with human frailty. The divine marriages they celebrated became the seeds of their downfall. This tradition didn't die with Egypt. The shadow of royal incest traveled across centuries and continents, influencing kings and queens in Europe, where it would take on new forms and leave even deadlier scars. By the Middle Ages, Europe was no stranger to scandalous marriages, but here incest took on a new form. Unlike the pharaohs, who claimed divine imitation, medieval kings and queens defended incest for political survival. Royal marriages in Europe were not about love or companionship. They were chess moves on a massive board where the prize was a kingdom. A king's daughter wasn't just his child, she was a bargaining chip. A niece wasn't family, she was a potential queen. And cousins weren't seen as taboo, they were pawns in dynastic strategy. Take the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful families in Europe. For centuries, they ruled vast parts of Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire. Their strategy for holding power? Marrying within the family. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and generation after generation the bloodline grew tighter. Their reasoning was simple: by refusing to marry outsiders, they ensured their wealth, land, and power stayed in Habsburg hands. But this obsession with incest created a dynasty that was both mighty and doomed. The result was the infamous Habsburg jaw. Portraits of the family reveal elongated jaws, protruding lips, and distorted facial structures. Centuries of inbreeding had left its mark. Some heirs could barely chew properly, others struggled with mental health issues. By the time of Charles II of Spain, the dynasty was collapsing. Charles was so physically weak and mentally unfit that he became known as the Bewitched. His body was frail, his marriage was childless, and with his death in 1700, the once great Spanish Habsburg line ended. But the Habsburgs were not alone. Across Europe, incestuous marriages were justified as keeping the blood royal. The Catholic Church technically forbade marriages between close relatives, but popes often granted special dispensations for kings and queens. After all, who would dare deny the will of a monarch? What made these marriages even darker was the secrecy and manipulation behind them. Many brides were forced into unions while still teenagers, often with relatives decades older than them. They were told it was their duty to protect the throne. But behind the palace walls, these unions left scars, both physical and emotional, that shaped kingdoms. The irony was that incest, meant to strengthen dynasties, often weakened them instead. Infertility, genetic illnesses, and rival claims tore kingdoms apart. And yet, time and again, rulers returned to the same choice: family first, no matter the cost. Europe's royal incest scandals were not just family matters, they shaped wars, treaties, and even the borders of nations. Every forbidden marriage echoed across history, leaving consequences that outlived the very monarchs who made them. And as Europe sank deeper into this dangerous tradition, the stage was set for some of the most infamous scandals in royal history, marriages so shocking that they are still whispered about today. If there was ever proof that incest could destroy a dynasty, it was the tragic life of Charles II of Spain. His story has haunted historians for centuries, not only because of his shocking physical deformities but because his life symbolized the end of one of Europe's most powerful families, the Habsburgs. Born in 1661, Charles II came into the world already carrying the weight of centuries of inbreeding. His family had spent generations marrying close relatives, often uncle to niece or cousin to cousin. By the time Charles was born, his family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a tightly coiled loop. The results were devastating. Charles was born with what is now called the Habsburg jaw, a massive protruding chin and jawline that made speaking and eating nearly impossible. His tongue was so large and misshapen that he struggled to form words clearly. His teeth didn't align properly, and food often spilled from his mouth as he tried to chew. But the physical deformities were just the beginning. Charles was sickly from birth, suffering from constant fevers, stomach issues, and seizures. His legs were so weak that he didn't learn to walk until he was nearly 8 years old. Modern genetic studies suggest he may have carried multiple rare disorders due to the extreme inbreeding of his parents. Mentally, too, he struggled. Nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, by his own subjects, many believed Charles was cursed. Superstitious Spaniards whispered that dark magic was responsible for his ailments, but the truth was written in his bloodline. As king, Charles II was unable to govern effectively. He was easily manipulated by advisors, his decisions erratic, his health failing. Worse still, he was unable to produce an heir. Despite marrying twice, both unions remained childless. Centuries of incest had left him sterile. When Charles finally died in 1700, he was just 39 years old, but his body was said to be so frail that he looked decades older. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of Europe's largest conflicts, because there was no direct heir to claim his throne. The mighty Spanish Habsburg dynasty, once rulers of half the known world, was extinguished in a single generation. Historians now look back at Charles II as the ultimate warning of what happens when power and tradition outweigh reason. His tragic life was not just the story of a man, it was the story of a family destroyed by its own obsession with purity. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs showed Europe that incest didn't just damage individuals, it could destabilize entire nations. And yet, despite this catastrophic example, royal incest continued to surface in other courts across the continent. Because where power was at stake, rulers were always willing to risk everything, even their bloodline. While the Habsburgs in Spain were visibly crumbling under the weight of inbreeding, England and France were fighting their own battles with forbidden unions, though here, the consequences often came in the form of political turmoil rather than physical deformity. In medieval and early modern Europe, marriage was the strongest political weapon a monarch could wield. But sometimes, those marriages crossed lines that religion, law, and society struggled to accept. Take England's Plantagenet dynasty. Their family tree is filled with cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and claims to thrones that overlapped dangerously because of it. One infamous case was Edward IV's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. While not incest in the strict genetic sense, the union caused outrage because Elizabeth was distantly related to several nobles already tied to Edward's rivals. The tangled web of family ties sparked decades of feuds, eventually fueling the Wars of the Roses. Then there was the case of Henry VIII. While his story is more famously tied to his 6 wives, at its core, his marital scandals also revolved around incestuous laws. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was controversial because she had first been wed to Henry's older brother, Arthur. According to biblical law, marrying a brother's widow was forbidden; it was considered incestuous. Henry used this very argument years later when he sought to annul the marriage, claiming their lack of a male heir was God's punishment for their forbidden union. His obsession with this argument sparked England's break from the Catholic Church and the creation of the Church of England, all because of an incest-related scandal. Across the Channel, France had its own share of drama. The medieval Capetian and Valois dynasties were notorious for cousin marriages that intertwined noble bloodlines until claims to the throne became dangerously entangled. This culminated in the 100 Years' War between England and France. Both nations' kings traced their claims back to shared ancestors, and because of incestuous dynastic unions, multiple heirs had equally valid rights. The result? Over a century of brutal conflict. Even more scandalous were the whispers surrounding Louis XIV, the Sun King. His sprawling family tree included marriages between close cousins, and rumors circulated about the royal court's relaxed attitude toward forbidden relationships. While the grandeur of Versailles dazzled the world, beneath the glittering chandeliers lurked the same dynastic practice of marrying relatives to consolidate power. The real danger in both England and France wasn't just genetics, it was political instability. Forbidden marriages created rival claims, divided noble houses, and gave fuel to rebellions. What began as a strategy to keep power in the family often ended up pushing kingdoms into chaos. These stories prove that incestuous unions weren't just private scandals, they were catalysts for some of the biggest wars and political shifts in European history. And yet, even with the chaos they caused, royal families refused to abandon the practice. For them, it was always the same gamble: blood, power, and the throne. When it came to incest, medieval Europe lived under the shadow of a powerful authority, the Church. According to canon law, marriages between close relatives were strictly forbidden. In fact, the Catholic Church at one point banned marriages between people related up to the 7th degree of kinship. That meant even distant cousins could fall under suspicion. But here's the twist: while the Church claimed to guard morality, it often bent the rules for powerful kings and queens. For ordinary peasants, an incestuous relationship, even with a distant cousin, could mean public humiliation, annulment of the marriage, or worse. For royals, however, the same law could be conveniently ignored or rewritten. One of the most infamous examples was Pope Julius II granting a dispensation for Henry VIII to marry Catherine of Aragon, even though she had been married to his brother. The Church blessed the union at first, until Henry later used the same law to argue the marriage was cursed. The hypocrisy was glaring, but it showed the Church's willingness to twist morality when politics demanded it. Society, too, was caught in a strange paradox. On one hand, ordinary people whispered in shock about royal incest scandals, treating them as both sinful and unnatural. Gossip spread like wildfire whenever a king or queen married too close within their bloodline. Poets and chroniclers often hinted at these unions with scandalous tones, fueling public fascination. On the other hand, many subjects accepted it as the way of royalty. People believed kings and queens were divinely chosen, almost superhuman, and therefore above ordinary laws. If incest was the price of keeping royal bloodlines pure, then so be it. In fact, some peasants even admired the idea of keeping power tightly within one family. It made rulers seem more untouchable, more mysterious. The Church's role was especially complicated because incest gave it immense power. By holding the authority to approve or deny a marriage, the Pope could make or break alliances between kingdoms. Royal families often had to beg, bribe, or negotiate for dispensations. This turned the morality of incest into a political weapon. But this balancing act couldn't last forever. When incestuous unions led to visible deformities, childless dynasties, and wars, society's whispers grew louder. By the late medieval period, people increasingly saw these scandals not just as sinful, but as curses that could doom entire nations. And yet, despite outrage, despite warnings, and despite religious restrictions, the practice continued. Why? Because for rulers, the throne was worth any price, even one written in the blood of their own family. This uneasy silence between morality and power is what kept royal incest alive for centuries, the church condemning it publicly, society whispering about it privately, and kings ignoring both when it suited their ambitions. Behind the glittering crowns and golden palaces, incestuous unions often created a hidden world of suffering, especially for the women and children trapped inside them. For queens and princesses, marriage was rarely about love. It was a transaction, a diplomatic tool, or worse, a prison. When they were forced to marry close relatives, the pressure was not just political but deeply personal. They lived with the fear of producing sickly heirs, knowing that every miscarriage, every weak infant, and every deformed child would be blamed on them. Take the tragic case of the Spanish Habsburg queens. Many were married off to their own uncles or cousins. These women gave birth to children who often died young, were mentally unstable, or bore visible deformities. Every royal stillbirth or sickly child wasn't just a private heartbreak, it was a public crisis. Queens were accused of being cursed, sinful, or even witches, even though the true cause lay in the inbreeding demanded by their families. For royal children, the cost was even higher. Some, like Charles II of Spain, were born into a life of immense wealth but also immense misery. His body was frail, his mind was clouded, and his entire life was a daily reminder of the dangers of incest. He was mocked as the bewitched king, but behind that cruel nickname was a child who had never asked to be born into such suffering. Princesses often paid with their futures. A daughter might be promised to her cousin or uncle while still a child, her fate sealed before she even understood what marriage meant. Imagine being a 12-year-old girl, forced to marry a man twice her age, who was also her blood relative. These unions robbed them of choice, freedom, and dignity. Even emotionally, the toll was crushing. Queens often lived in fear and isolation, trapped in courts that judged them not as human beings but as wombs for producing heirs. If they failed, they could be cast aside, like Catherine of Aragon, who was humiliated after years of devotion when Henry VIII annulled their marriage under claims of incest. The ripple effects of these tragedies spread beyond the palace walls. Whole nations suffered when incestuous unions failed to produce strong heirs, leading to wars, rebellions, and dynastic collapses. The personal pain of one queen could become the public misery of millions. At the heart of it all was the cruel irony. The very strategy meant to preserve royal bloodlines often destroyed them. It left broken families, sickly heirs, and grieving mothers in its wake. The suffering of these queens, princesses, and children reminds us that behind every scandalous headline and whispered rumor, there were real human lives, lives crushed under the unbearable weight of power, duty, and blood. By the end of the medieval and early modern eras, the consequences of royal incest could no longer be hidden. What had once been whispered gossip in court corridors became undeniable truths written in history itself. The most glaring example is the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs. Generations of incestuous marriages produced a dynasty so weak that by the time Charles II sat on the throne, the line was doomed. His infertility, illnesses, and eventual death without an heir sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped Europe's political map. In other words, centuries of incest didn't just destroy one family, it plunged nations into bloodshed. But the impact wasn't only political, it was cultural too. Chroniclers, poets, and later historians treated these unions as cautionary tales. They became moral lessons about the dangers of unchecked power, the arrogance of pure blood, and the human cost of putting dynasty above humanity. Even today, the word Habsburg jaw has become a symbol of what happens when incest is taken to extremes. The Church, too, was forced to adapt. Where it once granted endless dispensations for royal unions, it gradually tightened its stance. By the 18th century, incestuous marriages became far rarer, partly because rulers had finally realized the dangers, and partly because public opinion had shifted. The scandal was no longer something to be brushed under the carpet, it was a stain that could ruin a dynasty's legitimacy. For modern audiences, these stories hold a strange fascination. They shock us, horrify us, and yet draw us in. Perhaps because they reveal the darkest truth about power, even kings and queens, with all their wealth and glory, could not escape the consequences of their own choices. Their desire to control bloodlines ended up destroying them. The legacy of royal incest is still with us, not in practice, but in memory. It's a reminder that history is not just about grand battles and golden crowns, but also about fragile human bodies, broken families, and forbidden secrets. These scandals remind us that power, when misused, can corrupt not only politics but even the most intimate bonds of family. And so, centuries later, we continue to whisper about these forbidden unions, not because we celebrate them, but because they reveal the haunting truth: Even the mightiest royals could not outrun the curse of forbidden blood.